Staged a bomb attack in the Indonesian city of Surabaya just a day after suicide bombers hit 3 churches in the city. Now, the video that we've been seeing have been very disturbing to watch. Just a warning for you there. A family of 5 riding 2 motorbikes approached a security post at the police headquarters. Within seconds, they detonated their bombs. 4 of them instantly killed. 4 officers and 6 civilians were wounded. An 8-year-old girl who belonged to the family survived the attack. She was carried away to safety. We're also learning from Indonesian officials that another family that staged attacks on 3 churches on Sunday has indeed been linked to JAD, a jihadi group that supports ISIS in Indonesia. The group's leader is on trial, accused of being involved in several earlier bombings. Otso Iho is a senior analyst at James Terrorism and Insurgency Center at IHS Markit. He joins me now from London with more on this. And thank you so much for joining us. These are very disturbing attacks with links to ISIS. After the fall of the caliphate, we know that ISIS is fallen in Iraq and Syria. Are we now seeing ISIS regrouping and thriving in Indonesia?
Well, one of the things that the Islamic State has tried to do after its decline in Iraq and Syria is to make sure that it maintains influence around the world. And Southeast Asia is certainly and Indonesia is certainly part of that strategy. These attacks that we saw in Surabaya, they really fit into a wider pattern of Islamic State activity and attacks in Indonesia that really started with the attacks in Jakarta in January 2016. But we haven't really seen this kind of coordination before.
Yeah, these are highly coordinated attacks. These are also attacks that involved children. Today's suicide bombing was carried out by a family of 5. This came after another family carried out those church bombings over the weekend in the same city, Surabaya. Why is it that we're not just talking about foreign fighters here, but entire families are carrying out these attacks?
Well, the attacks being carried out by entire families is certainly unusual, but the involvement of entire families in radical Islamism is not particularly unusual. And if we think of Islamic State propaganda and messaging, over the last few months, there's been a substantial number of propaganda releases encouraging also women to take part in armed struggle. And indeed, children are also featured frequently in Islamic State propaganda, doing all sorts of awful things like conducting executions, for example. So from that perspective, the use of entire families in these attacks is not completely unprecedented.
Yeah, the use of families offers high propaganda value. These were, as you said, highly coordinated attacks. After this spate of bombings, suicide bombings in Indonesia, we know that the entire country is on high alert. Could this be just the beginning? Could there be more attacks to come even outside Surabaya?
It's a little bit early to say that. I'm sure that the counterterrorism authorities and security forces at the moment are trying to figure out how wide the network that these families were involved in actually is, whether there is any kind of central bomb-making capability, for example. In terms of the capability that these attacks showed, it doesn't differ hugely from what we've seen in Indonesia previously in terms of the use of quite crude improvised explosive devices, for example. But as we've seen, the frequency is kind of unprecedented. So it is possible at this point that that further attacks are still being planned, depending on what this network is actually like and how far it reaches.
As you mentioned, counter-terror officials in Indonesia are trying to gauge and get their head around just how sophisticated these terror groups are in their own country. The president of Indonesia, he has condemned these attacks as cowardly and inhumane. He has pledged to take action. What should he do next to fight the threat of ISIS in Indonesia?
One of the things to concentrate on is to try and alleviate sectarian tensions in Indonesia, because that's something that radical Islamist militants and the Islamic State and its affiliated groups in Indonesia are trying to worsen and are trying to incite with these attacks on religious minorities, and particularly, in this case, Christian churches. So trying to take measures to alleviate sectarian tensions and maintain kind of community cohesion is probably very, very important in that regard as a kind of top-level strategic measure.
Got it. Otso Iho of Janes joining me live from London. Thank you so much and take care. Now,